The Blood and Shadows of New York. The Rise. New York City, 1981. The Bronx was a battlefield dressed in neon lights and broken glass. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and gasoline. Subway cars were covered in graffiti, and the streets at night belonged not to families, but to hustlers and predators. It was a city alive with opportunity, but also a city drowning in decay. In these streets, a boy named Anthony Moretti learned the first lessons of survival. His father had been a dock worker, a man who broke his back on the Brooklyn waterfront until an accident left him crippled. With bills piling up and no steady income, the family relied on scraps, favors, and eventually the shadowy generosity of the local crew, the Martelli Syndicate, a small but vicious gang rising in the Bronx. Anthony was only 16 when he first carried a bag of cash for them. A small errand, nothing violent, yet it marked the beginning of a life that would never turn back toward innocence. The Martelli Syndicate was led by Vincent "Vinny the Knife" Martelli, a man as charming as he was ruthless. His nickname wasn't for nothing. People said he could pull a blade faster than most men blinked. Vinny had started as a soldier for the old Sicilian bosses in Brooklyn but had broken away, forming his own crew with younger blood. Unlike the old dons who lived in the shadows, Vinny craved flash, expensive suits, Cadillacs, and women who draped themselves over him in nightclubs. To Anthony, Vinny was everything: power, respect, fear. By the age of 18, Anthony had already been brought deeper into the fold. He was running numbers, collecting debts, and sometimes serving as muscle when a lesson had to be taught. The Bronx streets whispered his name with the beginnings of respect. But respect in that world always came painted with blood. One of Anthony's earliest tests came on a cold winter night in 1983. The Martelli crew had a problem. A small-time gambler named Ricky Donahue, an Irish hustler who owed thousands and thought he could laugh it off. Vinny sent Anthony and two others, Marco Bellini, Anthony's childhood friend, and Salvatore Russo, a hot-headed soldier, to send a message. The three cornered Ricky outside a bar on Arthur Avenue. Snow fell thick, muffling the sounds of the city. Ricky pleaded, his breath turning into mist under the streetlight, but Salvatore's temper flared. A gun came out. Anthony froze, realizing for the first time that this wasn't just business. This was life and death. The shot echoed like thunder in the night. Ricky dropped, blood staining the snow. Anthony stood there, staring at the body, his heart pounding like war drums. That was the night he crossed the line. Vinny later patted him on the back, telling him, "You did good, kid. You didn't flinch. That's what makes a man in this business." But inside, Anthony felt something crack. Fear, guilt, or maybe excitement at the sheer power of it all. From then on, there was no turning back. As the 1980s rolled forward, the Martelli Syndicate grew bolder. They muscled into Manhattan nightclubs, extorting owners, supplying cocaine through Colombian contacts, and laundering cash through construction companies. Anthony rose quickly, his loyalty and sharp mind setting him apart. By his mid-20s, he was Vinny's protege, whispered about as the prince of the Martelli family. But with power came enemies. The Lombardi crew, rivals from Brooklyn tied to the old mafia bosses, saw the Martellis as upstarts who didn't respect tradition. Tension brewed, the streets bristled with guns, and Anthony realized that his life would be shaped not just by loyalty, but by survival. The first blood war was on the horizon. The streets of New York in the 1980s were painted with contradictions. Towering skyscrapers lit up the skyline, symbols of American ambition, while only blocks away, neighborhoods were suffocating under crime, poverty, and decay. In the Bronx, gunshots were as common as car horns, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. For Anthony Moretti, these streets became both his battlefield and his classroom. By 19, his name carried a weight that no longer belonged to a boy. The Martelli Syndicate had groomed him into a soldier, and now he was learning the art of power. How to inspire loyalty, how to strike fear, and how to survive in a city where betrayal lurked behind every smile. The mentor and the prince. Vincent "Vinny the Knife" Martelli was more than a boss. He was a teacher of shadows. He schooled Anthony in the ways of the underworld. How to read a man's eyes to see if he was lying, how to hold silence until someone begged to fill it with words, how to make a threat without raising your voice. Power, Vinny told him one night as they sat in the back of a dimly lit Italian restaurant, isn't about who pulls the trigger. Power is about who decides when the trigger gets pulled. Remember that, kid. Guns are cheap. Fear is priceless. Anthony absorbed every word. He began to dress sharper, speak slower, and carry himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen blood and lived through it. The crew started calling him Prince, Vinny's heir in everything but name. The expansion. The Martelli syndicate had started small, running protection rackets in the Bronx and dabbling in stolen goods. But by the mid-'80s, they were reaching higher. Cocaine had flooded New York, and Vinny seized the wave with both hands. Through Colombian intermediaries, shipments poured in, hidden in crates of fruit and textiles. Nightclubs in Manhattan, places where Wall Street sharks mingled with models and celebrities, became their playground. The Martellis controlled the doors, the drugs, the protection. Money flowed like champagne, and Anthony was at the center of it all. He remembered the first night he walked into Club Mirage, a glittering palace of glass and neon. Music pounded, lights strobed, and everywhere he looked, people were laughing, drinking, dancing. But behind the glamour, he saw the fear. The owners bowed when Vinny's men entered, the bartenders slipped envelopes of cash without a word, and even the toughest bouncers kept their eyes lowered. That was power. The first betrayal. But power always came with cracks. In 1985, Marco Bellini, Anthony's childhood friend, the boy who had once shared stolen cigarettes with him behind school, began skimming money from collections. It started small, a few $100s here and there, hidden away for his girlfriend and their unborn child. But in the world of the Martellis, loyalty was absolute, and theft was unforgivable. When Vinny found out, the order was simple. Marco had to go. The assignment fell to Anthony. The night was cold, rain washing the city in silver streaks. Anthony drove Marco to the Harlem River under the pretense of a pickup. They talked like old times, laughing about girls and fights they'd gotten into. Marco trusted him completely. When they reached the river, Anthony pulled the gun. Marco's eyes widened, confusion giving way to terror. "Tony, it's me. We grew up together. You can't." Anthony's hand shook, but he remembered Vinny's words. Power isn't about pulling the trigger. Power is about deciding when it gets pulled. Tonight, he had no choice. The shot echoed across the water. Marco crumpled, his voice silenced forever. Anthony stood there in the rain, his soul screaming even as his face remained stone. That was the night he realized the price of the life he had chosen. He had killed not an enemy, but a brother. And in doing so, he had proven himself loyal to the Martelli syndicate above all else. The rivalry. The death of Marco sent ripples, but bigger storms were coming. The Lombardi crew, based in Brooklyn, saw the Martellis rise as an insult. The Lombardis were old school, tied to the traditional mafia families that had ruled New York for decades. They believed in hierarchy, codes, and respect for the old dons. The Martellis, by contrast, were young, brash, and loud. They didn't hide their wealth. They flaunted it. For the Lombardis, it was disrespect. For Vinny, it was survival. A new way for a new era. The first clashes were small. Trucks hijacked, safe houses robbed, messages sent through beatings and broken bones. But soon, blood painted the streets. One night, as Anthony left Club Mirage, a black sedan screeched around the corner. Windows rolled down, muzzles flashed. Bullets sprayed the sidewalk. Anthony dove for cover as glass shattered and screams filled the air. When the smoke cleared, 2 of his men were dead, their bodies sprawled on the pavement. The war had begun. Lessons in blood. The months that followed turned New York into a chessboard of violence. Drive-bys, ambushes, bombs hidden in cars. The Lombardi versus Martelli feud consumed the underworld. The police cracked down, the newspapers screamed, but nothing slowed the carnage. For Anthony, it was a trial by fire. He learned to sleep with one eye open, to check every car before starting it, to trust no one completely. He also learned the terrible weight of command. When soldiers under him died, it was his responsibility to send flowers to their families, and his responsibility to order vengeance. One night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights. He thought about Marco, about Ricky Donahue, about the faces of the men who had fallen on both sides. He wondered if he was losing his soul, or if it had been lost long ago. Yet when morning came, he put on his suit, his Rolex, his cold expression. The prince of the Martelli syndicate had no room for doubt. The turning point. By the late 80s, Anthony had become indispensable to Vinny. He handled negotiations, oversaw shipments, and even smoothed relations with corrupt cops and politicians. Some whispered that he was smarter than Vinny, more controlled, more dangerous. But Vinny's flash and recklessness were catching up to him. He spent money like water, flaunted his power, and attracted too much attention. The FBI began circling, building cases, planting informants, and the Lombardy War drained their strength. Anthony began to see the cracks in his mentor's empire. He started asking himself dangerous questions. Could he lead better? Could he build something lasting, something greater than Vinny ever dreamed? Ambition stirred in his heart, ambition painted with blood. The prince was no longer content to serve. He was ready to rule. The empire. The streets of New York in the mid-1930s pulsed with a rhythm of their own. Jazz spilled out of smoky clubs in Harlem, mingling with the shouts of street vendors and the rumble of elevated trains in Brooklyn. Prohibition had ended, but the underworld it birthed had not disappeared. Instead, it had adapted, found new veins of money in gambling, racketeering, and unions. For the Martelli brothers, this was no longer survival, it was expansion. Salvatore Martelli, the eldest, had always been the strategist. He saw beyond petty thefts and bootleg liquor. He saw systems, networks, the veins of the city that carried power. By 1934, he had convinced his younger brothers, Vincenzo, Carlo, and Luca, that their future lay not in back-alley deals, but in building something bigger. Something lasting. They began in Harlem. A jazz club called the Velvet Note, owned by a weary Sicilian immigrant, was drowning in debt. The Martellis stepped in, offering protection from loan sharks and rival street gangs. Within months, the club wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, a place where musicians like Duke Ellington's protégés played for crowds of businessmen, politicians, and young dreamers. But behind the velvet curtains, in smoke-filled backrooms, dice rolled and cards turned, with the Martellis taking a cut of every dollar lost. The money poured in. The rise of the network. The Martellis knew gambling alone wouldn't be enough. Carlo, the most charismatic of the brothers, struck deals with corrupt union leaders down at the Brooklyn docks. Longshoremen who wanted steady work paid dues not just to their union, but quietly to the Martellis, who guaranteed them shifts and kept rival gangs at bay. Shipments came in, sometimes legitimate cargo, sometimes crates of contraband whiskey still smuggled from Canada. Either way, a slice of profit ended up in Martelli hands. By 1936, their influence stretched from Harlem to Brooklyn, touching the Bronx and even the shadowy corners of Manhattan's garment district. Vincenzo, sharp-eyed and ruthless, handled enforcement. Anyone who refused to play along quickly found their shops burned, their windows smashed, or their kneecaps broken. Yet Vincenzo carried out violence with a chilling precision, never too much, never too little, just enough to remind the city who was in charge. And Luca, the youngest, became their shadow. He was quiet, observant, learning everything. He counted money, tracked shipments, and memorized the faces of every cop, politician, and rival who crossed their path. Though underestimated by many, Luca's mind was a vault, storing every secret that would later prove essential. A city of rivals. But New York was never a city that allowed one empire to rise uncontested. The Martellis soon found themselves facing enemies on every corner. In Brooklyn, the Romano family, an old Neapolitan clan with roots in the waterfront since the 1910s, saw the Martellis as trespassers. A bloody street fight outside a fish market left 2 Romano soldiers dead and a silent war simmering. Meanwhile, in Harlem, the Martellis clashed with Dutch Schultz's remnants, Irish and Jewish gangsters who refused to surrender control of numbers rackets. Though Schultz himself had been gunned down in '35, his men lingered, desperate and unpredictable. And hovering above them all was the shadow of La Cosa Nostra itself, the powerful Sicilian network that demanded tribute from every rising crew. Salvatore, calculating as ever, knew they could not avoid this forever. To build an empire, they would either need allies, or to prove too dangerous to ignore. The meeting at Delmonico's. One rainy night in 1937, Salvatore arranged a dinner at Delmonico's, a legendary Manhattan restaurant where deals were sealed between senators and gangsters alike. The guest was none other than Joseph Bonacera, a mid-level capo in the Sicilian Mafia. Salvatore arrived in a tailored suit, Carlo and Vincenzo flanking him, while Luca remained at a nearby table, listening without appearing to listen. Bonacera, older and heavier, sipped red wine as he eyed the brothers. "You've been making noise," Bonacera said, voice low but sharp. "Harlem clubs, Brooklyn docks. The Romano boys whisper that the Martellis don't know their place." Salvatore smiled, calm as a priest at confession. "With respect, Mr. Bonacera, the city has enough for everyone. We don't seek war. We seek structure." "Structure?" Bonacera smirked. "You mean power." "Power brings order," Salvatore replied smoothly. "And order brings money. For all of us." The meeting ended without promises, but also without threats. It was a beginning. Salvatore knew the Mafia was watching. The Martellis were still small fish compared to the five families, but they were swimming faster than anyone expected. The cost of blood. Expansion always demanded blood. In 1938, tensions with the Romanos boiled over. One humid August evening, Vincenzo led a crew into a Romano gambling den in Red Hook. What began as intimidation turned into a massacre. 3 Romano soldiers shot dead, a 4th left clinging to life. The newspapers the next morning screamed of gangland violence, and Italian feud explodes in Brooklyn. The city buzzed with fear, but also respect. The Martellis had proven they weren't afraid of blood. Yet Salvatore was furious, not at the violence itself, but at the attention. "The papers bring the cops, and the cops bring heat," he snapped at Vincenzo. "We win wars in silence, not in headlines." Still, the blood had been spilled, and with it, territory opened up. The Romanos reeled, their grip on the docks weakening. Carlo stepped in, charming foremen and union bosses with promises of steady pay. Within months, Red Hook belonged to the Martellis. But Luca noticed something that his brothers overlooked. For every victory, they made another enemy. The Romano survivors whispered revenge. The Mafia observed carefully, weighing whether the Martellis were assets or liabilities. The Velvet Night. By the end of the decade, the Martellis' empire glittered like the lights of Times Square. They owned clubs in Harlem, controlled docks in Brooklyn, skimmed from construction unions in Manhattan. Money flowed like never before, enough to buy politicians, police captains, and even judges. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Vincenzo grew reckless, hungering for blood over strategy. Carlo drowned in the excess of nightclubs, his charm slipping into arrogance. And Luca, still quiet, began to see that their empire stood on unstable foundations, built on fragile alliances and endless violence. On New Year's Eve 1939, at the Velvet Note, champagne bottles popped as jazz filled the air. Salvatore raised a glass, toasting his brothers and their kingdom. Guests cheered, women danced, and the city outside roared with horns and fireworks. Yet in the shadows of the club, Luca stood apart, watching the door, the windows, the crowd. He felt it deep in his bones. Their rise had been meteoric, but meteors burned brightest just before they fell. And as the clock struck midnight, Luca whispered to himself, almost inaudible under the music, "The empire has begun. But so has the end. The shadow of the law." By 1940, the Martellis had become a name whispered in every borough of New York. To ordinary citizens, they were ghosts. To politicians, they were silent benefactors. To the police, they were shadows too slippery to catch. But no empire could expand without attracting the attention of the law. Detective Frank Donnelly, a seasoned cop from Hell's Kitchen, had made a career chasing ghosts of the underworld. He knew the Martellis by reputation. Disciplined, clever, far more dangerous than the street-level thugs who stumbled into handcuffs. "They're not bootleggers anymore," Donnelly muttered to his partner as they watched the docks from an unmarked car. "They're businessmen with guns. And businessmen with guns, those are the hardest to bring down." The police tried raids. They busted gambling dens, roughed up union bosses, confiscated crates of smuggled liquor. Yet, like weeds, the Martelli operations grew back stronger, hidden deeper. Salvatore had cultivated politicians to shield them, and with every arrest, money changed hands to ensure light sentences or vanished charges. But Donnelly was relentless. He began trailing Luca, believing the quiet youngest brother to be the weak link. What he didn't realize was that Luca was watching him too, memorizing his habits, his routes, his allies. To Luca, knowledge was a weapon more lethal than any pistol. The Harlem Fire. Rivalries flared like kindling. In Harlem, the remnants of Dutch Schultz's men struck back. One spring night in 1941, a fire ripped through the Velvet Note. Flames devoured velvet curtains, smoke choked the air, and musicians barely escaped with their lives. The club that had been the crown jewel of the Martellis' empire was reduced to ashes by dawn. Salvatore stood in the ruins, his face a mask of fury. Carlo, half drunk, cursed the Dutchman with wild threats. Vincenzo, fists clenched, demanded immediate retribution. But Luca's eyes narrowed. "They want us to lash out," Luca said quietly. "If we hit them blindly, we give the cops their story, and Bonacera his excuse to cut us down. No. We rebuild. And then we strike where it hurts most." And rebuild they did. Within 6 months, a new club rose. Larger, grander, dripping with glamour. The Velvet Crown became not just a nightclub but a palace of the underworld, attracting celebrities, politicians, and mobsters alike. Behind the stage, where jazz played nightly, secret rooms buzzed with card games, rackets, and deals that shaped the city's shadows. The Martellis had turned a fire meant to destroy them into a blaze that announced their power louder than ever. Alliances and betrayals. With expansion came the delicate art of alliances. Salvatore knew they could not remain outsiders forever. In 1942, he secured a fragile pact with the Bonacera family. The Martellis would pay a percentage of their Harlem profits in exchange for recognition and protection under the Sicilian umbrella. But peace was never perfect. The Romano family, though bloodied, had not been destroyed. Their youngest son, Matteo Romano, returned from prison hardened, vowing vengeance. He aligned with remnants of Irish gangs in Hell's Kitchen, creating a hybrid crew that struck at Martelli shipments and ambushed soldiers in Brooklyn alleys. The war that followed was brutal. Bodies turned up in the East River, and whispers of betrayal echoed through the streets. Even within the Martelli ranks, loyalty faltered. Some soldiers began questioning Salvatore's reliance on Sicilian allies. Others grew restless under Vincenzo's violent temper. It was Luca who kept records, who noted which names failed to appear for meetings, which men pocketed more than their share. His silent ledger became the family's map of loyalty and treachery. And though he never raised his voice, his word carried weight. Salvatore began to rely on him more than anyone realized. The price of expansion. By 1943, the Martellis had woven themselves into the fabric of New York. They controlled gambling halls from Harlem to the Bronx, ran protection rackets in Brooklyn, and skimmed profits from the garment district in Manhattan. But power carried a price. Carlo, always the charmer, fell into excess. Nights at the Velvet Crown blurred into weeks, his face constantly photographed alongside chorus girls and actresses. His recklessness drew attention the family could not afford. Vincenzo, consumed by rage, launched attacks without approval. One such assault on a Romano ally ended with a dozen bullets sprayed across a crowded street. 2 civilians dead, 3 wounded. The headlines screamed "Gang war erupts in Brooklyn," and suddenly, the police tightened their net. Salvatore tried to steady the ship, but even his calm calculation was stretched thin. He had always believed violence must serve business. Now, it seemed his brothers were drifting into chaos. And Luca watched. He kept the books balanced, kept the secrets hidden, but inside, he began to wonder. Could the Martelli empire survive its own family? The gathering storm. The world outside their empire was changing. America had entered the war, and young men marched off to fight overseas. Factories boomed, unions swelled, and with them, opportunities for graft multiplied. The Martellis dipped into war contracts, skimming from steel shipments and siphoning funds from government projects. Their influence spread like oil on water, impossible to contain. But so too did the danger. Detective Donnelly, still hunting them, found allies in federal agents. Whispers of indictments, tax evasion cases, and racketeering charges swirled. For the first time, the Martellis felt the weight of the government, not just the street. And in the shadows, Matteo Romano prepared his final play. He had gathered allies, secured weapons, and set his sights not on soldiers, but on the brothers themselves. For Matteo, vengeance was no longer about territory. It was about blood. Midnight at the Velvet Crown. On a rain-slick night in 1944, the Velvet Crown glittered with music and laughter. Inside, Carlo danced with a showgirl, Vincenzo argued with a soldier, Salvatore negotiated with a union boss. But outside, in the alley behind the club, shadows moved. Romano's men, armed with Tommy guns, crept toward the back entrance. It was Luca who saw them first. Standing near the service hallway, ledger in hand, he glimpsed movement where there should have been none. Without hesitation, he slammed the alarm bell, a sharp metallic clang that cut through the music. Gunfire erupted. Windows shattered, patrons screamed, chaos flooded the club. Romano's men poured bullets into the walls, but the Martelli soldiers returned fire with equal ferocity. When the smoke cleared, bodies littered the alley. 2 Romano gunmen lay dead, a third dying in the gutter. Carlo was grazed, Vincenzo wounded in the arm. The Martellis had survived, but barely. And Luca, for the first time, had saved them not with numbers or whispers, but with action. Salvatore clapped a hand on his shoulder, eyes fierce. "You're not just our shadow anymore, Luca. You're our future." The empire still stood. But the war was far from over. And as the 1940s rolled on, the Martellis would discover that the deadliest enemies were not only outside their walls, but within their own blood. Fractures in the family. By late 1944, the Martelli empire was stronger than ever on the outside. But inside, fault lines deepened. Carlo's decadence became a liability. He was photographed stumbling drunk into a police wagon after a brawl with a Broadway actor. Though charges were dropped, the press splashed his face across the front page, branding him the Playboy of Harlem. Salvatore raged at him, warning that they could not afford such attention. "You think this is a game, Carlo?" Salvatore snapped, slamming a glass onto the table. "Every headline with your face puts a target on all of us." Carlo sneered, his pride wounded. "Maybe people need to see us. Maybe fear isn't enough. Maybe power means being seen." Vincenzo sided with Carlo, arguing that visibility cemented dominance. To him, swagger was as important as strategy. But Luca, quiet as always, shook his head. "Visibility invites enemies," he murmured. "And enemies never sleep." The brothers argued late into the night. Their unity, once unbreakable, began to unravel. Blood on the docks. The Romano War flared again in 1945. Matteo Romano struck boldly, hijacking a Martelli shipment of weapons meant for the black market. The ambush left 3 Martelli men dead, their bodies dumped on the Brooklyn docks as a warning. Vincenzo, furious, demanded retribution. Against Salvatore's orders, he gathered loyal soldiers and launched an assault on a Romano gambling hall. Guns roared, blood splattered, and by dawn, 12 men lay dead, including civilians caught in the crossfire. The newspapers exploded with headlines. "Gang Massacre Rocks Brooklyn." Politicians clamored for action. Police flooded the streets. For the first time, the Martellis felt the full fury of public outrage. Salvatore was livid. He summoned Vincenzo, slamming the newspaper onto the table. "You've doomed us all," Salvatore hissed. "This isn't war, it's suicide." But Vincenzo's pride burned hotter than reason. "I won't let Romani dogs spit on our name. Better to die fighting than bow to anyone." The brothers stood inches apart, their bond stretched to breaking. Only Luca's calm presence prevented blows from being thrown. Yet in that moment, Salvatore realized, control was slipping through his fingers. The deal with the devil. Amid chaos, opportunity emerged. Don Vito Bonacera, the Sicilian patriarch, extended his hand. "You bleed too much, Martelli," Bonacera said in his gravelly voice during a clandestine meeting. You lose men, money, reputation. Let me shelter you. Join under my wing fully, and your enemies will vanish. Salvatore knew the offer was poison. To bend to Bonacera meant surrendering their independence, becoming pawns in a larger game. Yet the alternative, annihilation at the hands of Romano and the law, loomed heavy. He agreed to a truce but resisted full submission. This angered Bonacera, who saw the Martellis as arrogant upstarts. A seed of betrayal was planted that night, though none of the brothers recognized it yet. Betrayal in the ranks. Luca's ledger revealed unsettling truths. Soldiers were disappearing, switching sides, feeding information to Romano and perhaps even Bonacera. One name stood out, Angelo Vitali, a trusted lieutenant of Vincenzo. When confronted, Angelo swore loyalty. But weeks later, a Martelli safe house was raided with surgical precision. Men were slaughtered before they could draw guns. The betrayal was confirmed. Angelo had sold them out. Vincenzo, humiliated, executed Angelo himself in a dimly lit basement. The act was swift, brutal, a pistol shot to the head. But the damage lingered. Distrust spread like poison. Soldiers glanced at one another with suspicion. Paranoia gnawed at the empire's foundation. The fall of Matteo Romano. The war reached its climax in the winter of 1946. Matteo Romano, emboldened by Martelli fractures, planned an assassination at the Velvet Crown. But Luca anticipated the move. His careful notes, his obsessive tracking of patterns, revealed gaps that led straight to Romano's hideout. The brothers gathered one final time, united by necessity. Carlo for once sober, Vincenzo grim but resolute, Salvatore cold with calculation. Together, they stormed the Romano warehouse under cover of night. Gunfire split the air, echoing across frozen docks. Romano's men fought like cornered wolves, but the Martellis pressed on with ruthless precision. At last, Matteo Romano himself emerged, Tommy gun blazing. He screamed curses, bullets tearing through crates. But Salvatore's shot found its mark. Matteo crumpled, lifeless, his vengeance ended. The Romano threat was finished. But victory came at a cost. Dozens of Martelli soldiers lay dead. Their power remained intact, yet their ranks thinned, their unity fractured. Luca's rise. In the aftermath, Salvatore realized the empire could not survive without change. Carlo was unreliable, Vincenzo uncontrollable. Only Luca had shown foresight, patience, and an instinct for survival. At a dimly lit table, surrounded by the smoke of dying cigars, Salvatore spoke quietly. The Martelli name must endure, but it cannot endure as it is. Luca, you must take the reins. Luca resisted at first. He had never sought the throne. But deep down, he knew this was inevitable. The shadow had always been watching, waiting, learning. Now, the shadow would lead. The silent king. By 1947, the Martelli Empire was reborn under Luca's subtle hand. He reshaped their operations, retreating from reckless bloodshed and focusing on business, construction, unions, even legitimate fronts. He ruled not with fury, but with silence. Men feared him not for his violence, but for his patience. In every whispered deal, every careful silence, they saw a man who knew everything and spoke only when it mattered. Carlo faded into the background, lost in indulgence. Vincenzo, though restless, bowed to Luca's quiet authority. And Salvatore, weary from decades of battle, finally found peace knowing his brother carried the mantle. Shadows over New York. The Martelli Empire did not end in fire or blood. It endured, slipping deeper into the fabric of the city, unseen but ever present. Politicians shook their hands in private, businessmen cut deals in smoke-filled rooms, and the streets whispered their name with reverence and fear. But beneath it all lingered the eternal truth of the underworld. Empires rise, empires fall, and power is the most fleeting of crowns. And in the silence of his office, overlooking a city that glittered with neon and sin, Luca Martelli wrote in his ledger one final line. Power belongs not to those who shout, but to those who listen. Shadows of prosperity. By 1948, The Martelli empire appeared stronger than ever. Luca's quiet leadership brought stability where chaos once reigned. The city's docks hummed with activity, speakeasies overflowed with liquor, and construction sites bore the Martelli stamp hidden beneath layers of cement and steel. Politicians who once denounced gang violence now whispered promises over glasses of scotch, accepting envelopes thick with cash. Yet prosperity carried its own dangers. Wealth bred envy, and envy bred betrayal. Carlo, the once flamboyant playboy, had sunk deeper into excess. His nights blurred with champagne, women, and dice. He squandered fortunes, and whispers spread that he owed debts not only to gamblers but to rival families eager to exploit his weakness. Vincenzo simmered with frustration. Luca's deliberate, patient rule felt to him like stagnation. Where was the fire? The glory? He longed for conquest, for headlines, for the kind of fear that made men tremble at the Martelli name. And Salvatore, the elder, grew frail. Illness gnawed at him, though he tried to mask it. His cough rattled through smoke-filled meetings, his once iron voice softening into gravel. He watched the family he had built begin to fracture, powerless to stop the tide. The new enemy. Just as the Martellis consolidated their grip, a new force arose. The Black Serpents. They were not Sicilian, nor tied to old codes of honor. Born from the post-war chaos, they were a mix of ruthless Irish bruisers, Puerto Rican smugglers, and American-born hustlers who laughed at tradition. Led by Declan O'Rourke, a cunning ex-soldier with scars across his face, they sought not balance, but domination. Their creed was simple: take everything. The Serpents struck fast. A Martelli truck loaded with contraband cigarettes vanished on the Jersey Turnpike. A gambling den in the Bronx burned to the ground. Its charred remains a message. The old ways of negotiation, of truce and counsel, meant nothing to Declan. He fought like a man who had seen war, and in truth he had. His soldiers were veterans too, men hardened by Normandy and Okinawa, men who laughed at death. For the first time under Luca's reign, fear crept into Martelli streets. The fracturing, the serpent threat demanded unity. Instead, it revealed the family's fractures. Carlo, drowning in debts, secretly reached out to the Serpents. He promised them information, access, anything to protect his own indulgent lifestyle. He believed Luca would never find out. Vincenzo urged all-out war. These snakes want to take what's ours. We cut off their heads before they strike again. His soldiers, still loyal to his fire, were ready. But Luca counseled patience. A storm can be weathered, Vincenzo. If we strike blindly, we bleed ourselves dry. Patience. Vincenzo spat. Patience will bury us. You sit with your books, your silence, while our enemies laugh. The brothers' argument exploded into shouting, fists nearly raised. Only Salvatore's trembling voice stopped them. Enough. We built this together. Don't let outsiders tear us apart. But Luca saw the truth in Vincenzo's eyes. His brother no longer trusted him. And Carlo, Luca suspected, was already lost. The assassination. It happened on a rain-slick night in 1949. Salvatore Martelli was leaving a doctor's office in Little Italy when gunfire shattered the quiet. Bullets ripped through the street, glass exploding, bystanders screaming. Salvatore staggered, blood blooming across his chest, before collapsing onto the pavement. By the time Luca and Vincenzo arrived, their brother, the founder, the patriarch, the iron voice, was gone. The message was clear. The Serpents had struck at the heart of the Martelli name. Grief turned to rage. Vincenzo demanded blood. Carlo wept drunkenly at the funeral, guilt twisting in his gut. Luca, his face stone, said little. But inside, he swore an oath. The Serpents would pay, no matter the cost. The war begins. Luca knew brute force alone would not defeat the Serpents. They were clever, mobile, and unbound by tradition. He devised a plan that combined intelligence, strategy, and calculated terror. He summoned his lieutenants to a hidden warehouse in Brooklyn, its walls lined with crates of contraband and the faint smell of oil and smoke. Each man present knew the stakes. If they failed, the Martelli name would crumble. Vincenzo wanted to strike immediately, to burn every Serpent hideout, To show the city the Martellis would not be humiliated. Luca listened, then laid out his vision. Infiltrate, gather information, and strike at the leaders. Cut off the head, and the body will follow. Carlo remained silent. His eyes darted around, avoiding Luca's gaze. Luca felt the unease. He knew his brother's betrayal was only a matter of time. The first skirmishes were brutal. Serpent-foot soldiers were ruthless, ambushing Martelli convoys in the dead of night, setting fire to warehouses, leaving the city trembling. The streets ran with fear. Every move Luca made was calculated. Every loss was noted. Betrayal in the family. One night, a tip came from an unexpected source. Carlo had secretly informed Declan O'Rourke about a Martelli arms shipment moving through the docks. The Serpents ambushed the convoy, killing several men, including Luca's most trusted enforcer Marco, the Hammer Ricci. Vincenzo discovered Carlo's betrayal but did not reveal it to Luca. Instead, he plotted his own form of justice, torn between family loyalty and the anger boiling inside him. The tension between the brothers thickened. Trust had been fractured, and no man could know who was loyal. Meanwhile, Luca's patience and strategy began to show results. They captured a low-ranking Serpent member, a young man barely 20, and Luca personally interrogated him. Using a combination of threats and promises, he extracted valuable intelligence. The Serpent's hideouts, financial backers, and plans for the next attack. The Siege of Brooklyn. The Martellis prepared a siege. Declan's main base in Brooklyn, an abandoned factory along the waterfront, became the battlefield. Luca's men surrounded the area under the cover of darkness. Snipers took positions, while Vincenzo led a small strike team to breach the perimeter. The battle was chaotic. Gunfire echoed across the river, smoke curled into the night sky, and screams punctuated the violence. The Serpents fought with desperation, but Luca's planning and the Martellis' discipline turned the tide. In the midst of the chaos, Carlo appeared unexpectedly, guiding a group of Serpent reinforcements into the fray. Luca's heart sank as he realized his fears were true. Carlo had betrayed them completely. The confrontation. Amidst the burning factory, Luca confronted Carlo. Why? Luca's voice was low, icy. Carlo sneered. You always thought patience made you strong. It only made you weak. Weak enough for me to take what I want. Vincenzo appeared behind Luca, gun in hand. End this, Luca. End it now. Luca, torn between brotherly love and duty, made his choice. Carlo was a traitor, and the Martelli name depended on loyalty. He advanced, calculated, precise. In the flickering light of the fire, a gunshot echoed. Carlo fell, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. The Serpents, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. Declan O'Rourke escaped into the night, vowing revenge. But the Martellis had reclaimed their city, for now. Aftermath of the siege. The Brooklyn streets were eerily quiet after the battle. Fires had burned themselves out, leaving charred ruins and twisted metal in the once bustling docks. Luca walked among the rubble, his coat soaked in ash and rain, feeling the weight of every life lost in the war. The Martelli family had survived, but at a cost. The young men who had fought bravely were either injured or traumatized. The streets whispered with fear, and the Serpents were scattered, licking their wounds and plotting revenge. Luca's gaze fell upon the Martelli insignia, still painted on a concrete wall behind the warehouse, slightly faded by smoke and fire. The city will remember who we are, he whispered. But deep inside, he knew it was only temporary. Crime, like a tide, ebbs and flows. The ghosts of betrayal. Carlo's betrayal haunted Luca. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's face, full of anger and disbelief at his own demise. Family, he realized, could be the sharpest weapon and the deadliest threat. Vincenzo tried to console him, but words were meaningless against such a deep wound. At the Martelli estate, the remaining family members gathered. Luca's mother, proud yet fearful, watched her sons with eyes full of both love and caution. Vincenzo had taken a more hardened stance after Carlo, and though the brothers were united now, trust had to be rebuilt, brick by brick. The blood of Martellis runs deep, Luca told them. But so does the shadow of betrayal. We cannot forget it, nor can we let it destroy us. We rebuild, but we remember. Rain and reflection. Months passed. Luca, now a legend in New York's underworld, had solidified his rule. The Martellis controlled Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of the Bronx, but Luca had learned a valuable lesson. Power without wisdom leads to ruin. He began forming alliances with other families, negotiating truces, and carefully selecting who could be trusted. Every handshake was weighed, every word measured. The city had changed, and Luca had changed with it. Sharper, more calculating, yet haunted by the faces of those lost. The price of power. One rainy night, Luca stood on the balcony of the Martelli estate, looking down at the streets below. Neon lights reflected off the wet asphalt, and distant sirens echoed like a haunting symphony. He thought of Carlo, Marco, the Hammer Ricci, and the countless others who had paid the price for loyalty, ambition, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Power was intoxicating, but it demanded a toll. Luca realized that to rule, one had to sacrifice everything. Friendship, innocence, and sometimes even one's own morality. And yet, despite the pain and loss, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment. The Martelli legacy, built on blood and strategy, had endured. Epilogue. The legacy. Years later, Luca's name became legend. New York whispered it with both fear and respect. Stories of his cunning, ruthlessness, and loyalty, or lack thereof, traveled beyond the city. The Martelli family, once near ruin, had reclaimed their empire, stronger and wiser than before. Yet Luca knew that empires were never permanent. The tides of crime, ambition, and betrayal would rise again. And when they did, a new generation would step forward to face the shadows, just as he had. Luca remained vigilant, a guardian of his family and a shadow over the city he ruled. The story of the Martellis was far from over, but for now, the streets of New York belonged to them. And in the quiet moments when the rain fell and the city slept, Luca allowed himself a rare smile, knowing that, despite the cost, he had survived, he had conquered, and he had become legend.